Welcome, everybody, to the ninth in our series of Japanese textiles, the Textile of the Month Club, I should say. Today, we'll be covering Nishiki, which is a type of weaving that came to Japan along the Silk Road, although the Japanese have taken it very much off in their own direction. A lot of the designs, as I mentioned, came along the Silk Road. So you'll notice along the way that many of them have Persian or Chinese, Indian influences to them. And here you can see we started with the drawing, the cartoon of this particular one. And this is what a contemporary rendering of it looks like. Japan, as you can see, is at the end of this long line of the Silk Road. And so if we follow our path all the way from the Middle East to the very end part here of Japan, what winds up happening is just about everything washes up on the shores of Japan. So whether they were textiles, ceramics, cultural aspects, all sorts of things traveled all the way from Greece and potentially further west than that, all along the Silk Road, wound up in Japan. And you can see along the way, it passed all through these Chinese areas, picking up influence along the way. And of course, each culture added its little bit to whatever artistic technique it was as it travels along the road. And as you can also see, and I'd like you to appreciate, is how very close Japan is to Korea. I've mentioned that in the past, but really, if you're down here in Kyushu, you can pretty much from a tall building see South Korea. Right? So if you keep that in mind, it's really not a very difficult jump to get from one to the other. As a matter of fact, they've just recently proposed building a tunnel under this section to reach Korea directly from Japan. But in either case, at the moment, you can see the path that all of these treasures have traveled. This then is a little bit larger version, a complete version of the piece we saw just a moment ago. This is a contemporary version of it. So what they'll do is take these ancient scraps, many of them from China, of course, and many of them wound up in Japan from China. And a great many of these textiles are stored in the Shosoin, which is sort of the national treasure house. So they'll take these little scraps, a little bit here, find a drawing there, and then try to reinterpret these and see if they can't reconstruct them. And this is an example of yet another textile fragment. All of these are nishiki. Now, the term nishiki is often used to mean bright and colorful. So if you think about Japanese block prints, they're called ukiyo-e, but they're also often called nishiki-e because they're very bright and colorful. Not all nishiki is necessarily multicolored, but in general it is, and very often it will also have metallics included. When Japanese say nishiki, you might be a bit confused because they'll look like very different weaves, and sometimes that is the case. Here are some more ancient pieces. Some of them actually even have a Coptic feel if you look at them that way, but unlike the Coptic, they are not tapestry weaves. This one actually, which very much fits within the Nishiki feel of patterning with all of the Middle Eastern influences, this one's actually a knotted rug. But you can see the commonality of the designs. So again, they're very ancient pieces with very Persian influences to them. This is one of my favorite patterns. As a matter of fact, the necktie that I'm wearing today does have this image on it, and I'll give you a close-up of that in just a bit. But you can see here the Persian hunters on their horses with the knotted tails. You can see Chinese characters on the sides of the horses. This particular piece belonged in one of the temples in Japan, the Horyuji. It was part of the national treasures of Japan. During the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was an artist, a weaving artist named Tatsumura. He was allowed to go in and access these ancient textiles and very, very carefully research them and work to reproduce them. And I'll touch on him again in just a moment. So one of the other characteristics of the Nishiki-ori is the fact that they use thicker threads. Now, when I say thicker, it's relative to other Japanese weaves. They're not particularly thick threads, but they tend not to be monofilament. They tend not to be single strands. They tend to be a little bit more flossy, meaning not spun quite so much as some other weaves might be. You can see that here in the weft threads, you have what appears to be a bundle of threads, and that it is. They're a bundle of single strands, but of course, in a tightly spun yarn, they would all become one. This is simply not spun very tightly. Here we have a depiction of the weave structure. And if you compare that to this one, you'll see how the weft threads actually peek out the top when required. So when you want to see the color, it pokes out the top, can travel quite a distance in some cases. But unlike some of the other weaves that we've covered, like Nishiki-ori as an example, the threads do not float across the back. They're contained within the weave. And so here again, you can see these various colors as they poke out on the surface, but in the back, they're not floating. All of these threads are contained within the structure itself. Now, often if you look at it from the back, that creates a somewhat striped appearance. Perhaps this will also give you a little bit better idea of how the warp threads are laid out in this case. It's very common to have striped patterns as the different colored threads are introduced. There is a type of warp nishiki as well as weft nishiki. They give slightly different appearances, but both are fairly common. Quite often the old key punch system was also used. And of course, in modern times, these are now computer driven. And here's a contemporary younger artist at work. On the left, you'll see the cartoon that has been prepared that the weavers are going to follow. And in this little corner right here, you can see the cards that are dictating how the warp threads are raised and lowered. On the right, you see what is often is the back of the weaving. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's quite often has a stripe-like feel to it. This is the sample that was included this month in your collection. And you can see it's very typically Nishiki. It has many colors, although it's not particularly bright. You can see that it has a typical medallion patterning to it, which is also very common in Nishiki. And so if we go ahead and look at this a bit closer, we can go ahead and pull in a detail of that, and you can start to see how the little bit thicker threads are poking out along the top. And if we take a look at the back of that, you can also see how the back really is not, as far as floating threads and so forth, it's not really much distinguishable from the front. Okay, they have this very similar texture. The back side has this characteristic stripe to it. And these are some commercial pieces. This is a very recognizable, very popular, very expensive weave in Japan. It's an important part of kimono clothing. The colors used for it may be either natural dyes, as you see on the left, or synthetic dyes, as you see being employed on the right. I put together a collection of cards that are listed on my website. The information that came with the textiles, these were obi originally, states that they're natural dyes. It tells us that this dyer, Junichi Fujiwara, is a first level natural dyer. Okay, and that's what all this label tells us. And then included are 4 different colorways of exactly the same pattern. So it's the same weave, all using natural dyes from the same weaving house, and they're just different uses of different colors within the nishiki to give you an idea of how great a range of emotion and color you can bring out in the textiles by varying the shades of color used. And this gives you a detail of one of those samples within the collection. This is the front side, which appears in the accordion book. And then I want to make sure as weavers and as dyers, you can see the back side also. So this is the back detail that you saw. And that's available on my website, of course. This happens to be a particularly favorite weave of mine, this hunter that I showed you just a moment ago, partly because it includes so many different cultures in its traveling to Japan. and also the history that Heizo Tatsumura brings to it. What you're seeing here in the center here typically appears on contemporary pieces. So if this is a modern manufactured piece, not necessarily by a particular artist, not necessarily by Heizo Tatsumura, well, as a matter of fact, it's specifically not by him, but it is from the Tatsumura weaving house that Heizo Tatsumura founded back in the early 1900s. And if you want to be sure that it's a Tatsumura weave, it will always have this mark on it. Okay, and you can look for that. Now at the top, what it's telling us is 100% silk. And of course, in English below, it tells us it's the Tatsumura weave. If it does happen to have been woven by Tatsumura himself, it will normally say so. And this gives you yet a different colorway. Okay, and this is a detail of that same piece. Also, this particular sample and other sample books that I've prepared, I like putting samples in books. This is a field guide for people to take on the road when they're traveling in Japan or out and about. And this table of content gives you an idea of what's included in it. But more specifically, it actually has one of these Tatsumura samples in it. On the left is also Nishiki, but on the right is a silk weaving from this Tatsumura dye house. So I really enjoy, I actively collect Tatsumura's work. It's not so ancient that it's hard to get hold of, but it is also very collectible. So in this particular case, we're looking at a square piece. These were done as collectibles early on. So he had a wonderful marketing technique. Basically, if you couldn't afford to buy a whole obi, and they were very, very expensive, have remained expensive, you could buy a trading card, I guess you'd call it. So these are about, it depends, they vary a bit, but about 24 inches wide or so square. And that's all, they were just one square. They weren't really to be used for anything unless you made a fukusa out of them. And at the very bottom here, it tells you the name of the pattern. It tells you the weaver, okay, which is Tatsumura Heizo. It tells you that it's Nishiki. And then it tells you the name of this particular pattern. And because it's similar to a baseball trading card in that sense, they have a great many different weaves in this series that people seek out. This is a photograph of Heizo Tatsumura. He was born in 1876 and died in 1972. In the recent decades, they've done a number of documentaries about his life, docudramas and so forth. Very interesting life. He struggled, of course, to get started early on and managed to build up this empire. But of course, all the while was heavily in debt while trying to get this business underway. And even though his textiles sold for enormous amounts of money, he was always behind because of the intense labor and cost of the goods and his extremely high standard of making sure that he stayed true to the original research from the shosoin, the textiles that he had access to. And that's what gave him his reputation, to the point that he was commissioned to weave pieces for the emperor and many other dignitaries. The wonderful thing to me about collecting these, Tatsumura in particular, is I've been able to collect not only his original work, and as I say, it always states in the margin, or I'm careful to get ones where his name is woven in, but I've also been able to collect his son's work and his grandson's work. This is an example of his grandson's work. So it's kind of fun to have three generations. I want to show you some of the textiles in the background here. So first of all, as I mentioned, this is the necktie that is done with the hunters. So it's one that I'm particularly fond of. And also with that in mind, I'd like you to take a look at the ones in the back. What I've done is pulled out two of the obi that I have of this hunter's design done in two different colorways. And so again, they present a very different feeling to them. And then I just grabbed a couple of others from the box. And here are two other items woven by Tatsumura as well. Again, with very different feelings. Now, the majority of Nishiki that you're likely to come across in collecting. It does have that sort of Chinesey Persian, a heavy on the Persian aspect of it, which the Japanese love so much, especially relative to tea ceremony textiles for covering the natsume, the tea caddy, for covering utensils, for fukusa used to to set things on, your tea bowl on. Those are all quite often Nishiki weaving, and it's very much up to the person participating to be educated in the textiles that they have. And so they'll be able to tell you what mill this came from, what pattern it is. And if they're really into it, they'll be able to tell you the types of weave, the types of dyes and so forth used as well. And I'd like to go ahead and point out this one in the framed piece. This is done by the grandson, and here again, sort of following his grandfather's collectible approach. He's doing smaller pieces, all about that size, that are of the zodiac sign. So that particular one is the year of the ox. He has other ones for year of the cow, year of the sheep, and so forth, which I've also been collecting, and that you can collect too if you'd like to. It's just fun to focus on an artist where you know his life history, his trials and tribulations, what he contributed to Japanese society, all of the intrigue that goes with him trying to get integrated into the business world. And so at some point I'll do another program focusing strictly on him and his life. I think you'll enjoy that as much as I do. Okay, so that covers it today for our Nishiki program. I'll go ahead and sign off this part of it, invite all of you to go ahead and turn back on your screens, and we'll go ahead and start with our question and answer section, okay?